I didn't mean to eavesdrop. That's the part that keeps replaying in my head. Because if I had gone looking for the truth, if I had pressed my ear to the wall on purpose, maybe I could tell myself I deserved what I heard. But I didn't. I was just walking down the hallway of my own house, barefoot, holding my phone, thinking about whether I had enough time to answer one more email before bed. And then I stopped. Because my name came out of my wife's mouth in a tone I'd never heard before. Low, careful, almost rehearsed. I'm Scott. I'm 36 years old. I've been married for 7 years, together for almost 10. I've always thought of myself as a reasonable guy. Not flashy, not dramatic. I work hard. I save. I plan. I like structure. I like knowing where things stand. That's probably why what happened next felt like the floor dropping out from under me. Because in one quiet moment, standing in a dim hallway, I realized I had absolutely no idea where I stood at all. My wife, Laura, and her mother were in the kitchen. The door was half closed, the light spilling out in a narrow yellow strip across the carpet. We'd had dinner together earlier. Normal dinner, normal conversation. Her mother had made one of those comments she always made, something passive and sweet on the surface, but sharp underneath. A joke about how I was lucky Laura handled the finances so well, since I was more of a big-picture guy. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because I always did. I didn't want to be the sensitive one. I didn't want to rock the boat. Laura's family had a way of doing that. Little comments. Little looks. Nothing you could point to and say, that right there, that crossed a line. Just enough to make you feel like you were constantly being evaluated and found slightly lacking. I told myself it was in my head. I told myself families were just like that. I married Laura, not her parents. Standing there in the hallway, I heard my mother-in-law's voice first. Calm. Practical. The way she sounded when she talked about refinancing or estate planning. Like she was discussing the weather. You just have to be smart about the timing, she said. He can't suspect anything yet. Not until everything is ready. There was a pause. I remember holding my breath without realizing it. Laura responded quietly. I know. I'm being careful. I've been moving things slowly. Small amounts. He doesn't really check. Something cold slid down my spine. I took a step back, then stopped myself. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I told myself I was misunderstanding. That this was about something else. That they couldn't possibly be talking about what it sounded like. Then her mother said, once the accounts are drained, it won't matter what he thinks. By the time he realizes, it'll be too late. You'll have control, and that's what matters. Drained. Accounts. Control. I leaned my shoulder against the wall, suddenly lightheaded. These weren't vague complaints or emotional venting. This was logistics. Strategy. Planning. The kind of conversation you have when you've already decided what you're going to do and you're just working out the details. Laura asked, and the divorce timing? Her mother didn't hesitate. After the holidays. That way you look generous for getting through them together. We'll make sure your father and brother are aligned. Everyone needs to be on the same page when it happens. He can't spin it against you. Her brother. Her father. My mind raced. Images flashed of family dinners, of shared jokes, of people I thought were on my side. Of all the times I'd covered a bill without mentioning it. All the weekends I'd spent helping her dad with projects. All the times I'd told myself, this is just how families are. I heard a chair scrape. Someone laughed softly. It might have been Laura. That sound hurt more than anything else, because it was familiar. It was the laugh she used when she was relieved, when a plan was coming together. He won't fight it, her mother continued. He's not confrontational. He hates conflict. And if he does try something, you'll already have what you need. The money, the narrative. Full support from us. He'll be scrambling just to keep up. They were talking about me like I wasn't a person. Like I was a problem to be managed. A variable to control. And the worst part was that everything her mother said about me was, on some level, true. I did hate conflict. I did trust too easily. I did assume the best of people, especially the people I loved. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough to hear more details. About which accounts Laura had access to. About how her mother knew a lawyer who understood situations like this. About how they'd frame things if I got emotional or upset. Calm voices. Careful words. No anger. No shouting. Just certainty. At some point, my legs started to shake. I realized I was gripping my phone so tightly my hand hurt. I backed away slowly, step by step, until I reached the bedroom. I closed the door without making a sound and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall while my pulse hammered in my ears. I didn't burst in and demand answers. I didn't confront Laura. I didn't do any of the things you'd expect someone to do in a moment like that. I just sat there, replaying every conversation from the past year. Every time she'd insisted on handling something to make it easier on you. Every time her mother had asked casual questions about my work, my savings, my long-term plans. I thought about our son asleep down the hall. I thought about how many decisions I deferred because I trusted my wife, because I believed we were a team. When Laura came into the bedroom later, she acted completely normal. She smiled, asked if I was coming to bed, complained lightly about how her mother worried too much. I nodded. I smiled back. I told her I was just tired. That night, lying next to her, listening to her breathe, I understood something very clearly. Whatever version of my marriage I thought I was living in, it wasn't real anymore. Something had shifted, and I couldn't unhear what I'd heard. And as much as part of me wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that would make everything okay again, another part of me, the quiet, analytical part one usually ignored, was already doing the math. If they were planning this so calmly, it meant it wasn't new. It meant it had been building for a while. And if that was true, then the disrespect I'd brushed off for years wasn't random at all. It was the beginning. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long they'd been planning to turn on me, and how much time I really had left before they did. I didn't confront Laura the next morning. I didn't even bring up the conversation. I told myself I needed time to think, to observe, to make sure I hadn't misheard or misunderstood. Part of me still wanted an innocent explanation, something that would let me walk back into the life I thought I had. So I did what I'd always done when things felt uncomfortable. I stayed quiet and paid attention. Once you start paying attention, it's impossible to stop. The first thing I noticed was how quickly the tone shifted whenever money came up. Laura used to ask, casually, how work was going or whether a bonus might be coming this quarter. Now the questions were more pointed, more frequent. She started phrasing them like concerns. Do you think your company is stable long-term? Or have you ever thought about what would happen if your income suddenly changed? She said it gently, almost lovingly, but there was something rehearsed about it, like she was checking boxes on a list. Her mother started calling more often too. At first it was under the excuse of wanting to spend more time with her grandson, which I welcomed. I wanted him to have a good relationship with his grandparents. But the visits stretched longer. She lingered in the house, commenting on things she'd never cared about before. She asked where we kept important documents. She made little remarks about how complicated finances could be for someone who doesn't deal with them daily. I laughed them off. I always did. I told myself she was just being overbearing, that it wasn't personal. Then came the first real slip. We were all at her parents' house for a family dinner. Laura's brother and his wife were there, along with her father, who mostly sat quietly and nodded along with whatever his wife said. Halfway through the meal, her mother brought up a story about a friend who'd gone through a divorce. She framed it like a cautionary tale, shaking her head sympathetically. The poor thing trusted her husband completely, she said. Didn't even realize what he was doing until it was too late. I felt Laura's hand tighten on mine under the table. And you know what's sad? Her mother continued, looking straight at me. Men like that always think they're the victims. They never see how much the woman is really carrying. No one contradicted her. Laura nodded slightly, like it was a reasonable point. Her brother smirked and took a sip of his drink. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I wanted to say something. I wanted to ask what exactly she meant by men like that. But the moment passed, and the conversation moved on, leaving me sitting there with a tight smile and a sinking feeling. On the drive home, Laura said nothing about it. When I asked if her mother's comment bothered her, she shrugged. She just worries too much. You know how she is. That phrase started coming up a lot. You know how she is. It became a blanket excuse for everything. The comments, the questions, the subtle digs. And every time, Laura positioned herself just slightly away from me, like she didn't want to fully stand on my side. The next few weeks blurred together in a way that only stress can cause. I started noticing small changes in our accounts. Transfers I didn't remember authorizing. Balances that seemed lower than they should have been. When I asked Laura about it, she had explanations ready. Oh, I moved that to cover a bill. Or, that's for the vacation fund, remember? She said it with such confidence that I doubted myself. I checked less often after that. Not because I didn't care, but because every time I looked, my stomach knotted, and I didn't yet know what to do with what I was seeing. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It came in layers. It came the day Laura suggested we put our savings into an account under her name only, just temporarily, because it would simplify things for an investment her mother recommended. It came when her father casually mentioned that Laura was better equipped to make long-term decisions for the family. It came when her brother joked, in front of everyone, that if anything ever happened between Laura and me, at least she'd land on her feet. I started sleeping badly. I'd lie awake at night, listening to Laura breathe, replaying conversations in my head, wondering how long she'd been thinking of me as an obstacle instead of a partner. I kept telling myself I needed proof. Something concrete. Something undeniable. I didn't have to wait long. One afternoon, Laura asked me to pick up our son from her parents' house after work. She said she'd be late, and told me to let myself in. When I arrived, the house was unusually quiet. I heard voices coming from the living room and stopped short when I recognized my name again. This time, I didn't feel frozen. I felt hollow. Her mother was speaking, voice clipped and confident. Once custody is settled, everything else will fall into place. Scott won't know what hit him. He's too focused on being agreeable. Laura responded, and there was no hesitation this time. I just don't want him to make this difficult. For our son's sake. Her mother scoffed. He doesn't need to know everything. You do what's best. You always have. I stood there, keys in my hand, staring at the wall as the last bit of denial drained out of me. This wasn't frustration or venting or hypothetical planning. This was real, ongoing, coordinated. I stepped into the room, and the conversation died instantly. Laura jumped slightly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her mother's expression hardened for just a second before smoothing over. "Oh, Scott," her mother said. "We didn't hear you come in." I looked at Laura, really looked at her, at the woman I'd trusted with my life, my finances, my child. She wouldn't meet my eyes. That night, I finally asked her directly. Not accusatory, not angry, just honest. I told her I felt like something was wrong, that I felt shut out, that I was scared we weren't on the same team anymore. She sighed like I was exhausting her. "You're overthinking everything," she said. "You always do this. You make things into problems when they don't need to be." That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not because she denied it, but because she didn't even try to understand why I was asking. The real betrayal came a few days later, wrapped in paperwork and smiles. Laura told me she'd scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor to get us back on track. She said it would help us communicate better. I agreed, because some part of me still hoped this could be fixed. When we arrived, I realized quickly that this wasn't a joint meeting. The advisor spoke mostly to Laura. He referenced documents I hadn't seen, accounts I didn't recognize, plans I wasn't part of. At one point, he turned to me and said, "Given the current structure, your access is already fairly limited." I felt my chest tighten. What structure? Laura answered for him. It was just easier this way. In that sterile office, with charts on the wall and strangers talking about my life like it was a spreadsheet, I finally understood the scope of what was happening. This wasn't a fight brewing. It was already underway. I nodded. I stayed calm. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. But as we walked out to the parking lot, something shifted. The fear gave way to clarity. The shock hardened into resolve. They thought I was passive, predictable, easy to manage. Standing there, watching Laura talk on her phone with her mother, already reporting back, I realized they had made one critical mistake. They thought I was still unaware. After that meeting, I stopped pretending. Not outwardly. On the surface, nothing changed. I still came home at the same time, still helped with bedtime, still nodded through conversations with Laura's parents. But internally, I was unraveling. The weight of it all hit me in waves. Some mornings I woke up with a tight chest and the strange sensation that my life had already ended and I was just walking through the aftermath. I'd stand in the shower, water running over my face, trying to breathe normally while my mind replayed every moment I'd missed, every red flag I'd excused. I felt stupid, not just hurt, but embarrassed. Like I'd failed some basic test of awareness everyone else seemed to pass. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't talk to Laura, obviously. Every conversation felt staged now, like she was playing a role she'd rehearsed for years. I couldn't talk to her family. I couldn't talk to my own parents yet either, not without admitting how bad things really were. So I carried it alone. And then the practical consequences started to land. One afternoon, my card declined at a grocery store. Not for anything extravagant, just a normal weekly run. I laughed awkwardly, apologized to the cashier, and tried another card. Same result. I ended up putting things back, my face burning, while people waited behind me. When I got home, Laura barely looked up from her phone. "Oh," she said lightly when I mentioned it. "I moved some funds around earlier. You should have told me you were going shopping." That sentence stayed with me. You should have told me. As if I needed permission to buy food in my own house. I checked our accounts later that night, really checked them this time. What I saw made my stomach drop. Balances were lower than I'd ever seen them. Entire chunks of money had been shifted into accounts under Laura's name alone. Some accounts I couldn't access at all anymore. Passwords had been changed. Notifications rerouted. I sat there in the dark, laptop open, realizing that if something happened to me tomorrow, I wouldn't even know where half my own money was. That was rock bottom. Not a dramatic explosion. No screaming match or slammed doors. Just the quiet understanding that the ground beneath me had already been hollowed out, and I'd been standing on it without realizing. The next few weeks were brutal. Laura grew colder, more dismissive. Her family stopped pretending to be polite. Her mother corrected me openly in front of our son. Her brother made jokes about backup plans and knowing your worth. No one told me outright that I was being pushed out, but everything pointed in that direction. I started doubting myself in ways I never had before. I second-guessed every instinct, every decision. I wondered if I really was as naive as they thought. If maybe I deserved this for being too trusting, too accommodating. There were nights I sat in my car after work, hands on the steering wheel, just staring through the windshield because going inside felt like walking into a courtroom where I was already guilty. And yet, somewhere in that mess, something else started to form. It wasn't anger at first. It was curiosity. One night, after Laura went to bed, I stayed up and pulled my credit report. Then another. Then I reviewed old statements I'd saved, emails I'd archived without thinking much about them at the time. Patterns started to emerge. Timelines. Small decisions that, when stacked together, told a very clear story. I began documenting everything. Quietly. Dates, amounts, conversations. I didn't know exactly what I'd need yet, only that I would need something. I also started reaching out, carefully, to people I trusted outside of Laura's orbit. An old colleague. A friend I hadn't spoken to in a while. I didn't dump everything on them. I just asked questions. Listened. Gathered perspective. One of those conversations changed everything. A friend asked me a simple question after listening quietly for a long time. If a client came to you with this situation, he said, what would you tell them to do? The answer came immediately. Protect yourself. Get informed. Stop assuming good faith where there clearly isn't any. That night, I slept better than I had in months. From then on, rebuilding became methodical. I started taking control where I still could. I redirected my income to a new account in my name alone. I locked down my credit. I quietly updated passwords and security questions. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would tip anyone off too soon. At the same time, I worked on myself in ways I hadn't in years. I started going to the gym early in the morning before anyone else was awake. It wasn't about looking better. It was about burning off the anxiety, reminding myself that my body still belonged to me, that I could push, endure, improve. I stopped apologizing for existing. I also started paying attention to my son in a different way, not just as a parent going through the motions, but as someone who understood that the example I set now mattered more than ever. I became more present, more patient. Bedtime stories lasted longer. Conversations went deeper. I wanted him to feel stable, even if everything else wasn't. Laura noticed the change. She commented on it once, casually. You seem different, she said, studying me like she was trying to decide whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Just focusing on work, I replied, which wasn't a lie. I threw myself into my job with a clarity I hadn't had in years. I took on projects I'd previously avoided. I spoke up in meetings. I stopped downplaying my contributions. Opportunities followed. Recognition followed. Slowly, quietly, my confidence began to rebuild itself from the inside out. The more grounded I became, the more obvious their behavior looked. It was like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the whole picture. The manipulation, the coordinated pressure, the assumption that I'd fold the moment things got uncomfortable. They mistook my silence for weakness. What they didn't realize was that silence had given me space to think. By the time Laura's mother started openly suggesting changes to our living arrangements in case things got tense, I was no longer panicking. I was observing, measuring, waiting. The fall had stripped me down to the essentials. No illusions, no excuses, just the truth of who I was and what I needed to do to protect myself and my child. I wasn't ready to act yet. Not publicly, not decisively, but for the first time since that night in the hallway, I felt steady, and that scared them more than they knew. Because while they were busy planning how to take everything from me, I was quietly learning exactly how much I was worth and how much power I still had left. By the time I started actively preparing, the emotional fog had lifted enough for me to think clearly. That didn't mean I was calm all the time. I still had moments where my hands shook or my chest tightened unexpectedly. But those moments no longer controlled me. They passed. And when they did, they left behind something sharper. Focus. I stopped thinking of what was happening as a betrayal in the abstract and started treating it like a problem that needed to be solved. Problems have inputs, patterns, leverage points. Once you see them that way, the emotional weight doesn't disappear, but it stops blinding you. The first thing I did was get professional advice. Quietly. I didn't tell anyone. Not Laura. Not her family. Not even my parents yet. I booked consultations under the excuse of long-term planning and hypothetical scenarios. I asked careful questions. I listened more than I spoke. I learned how situations like mine usually played out when one spouse thought they were 10 steps ahead and the other one wasn't actually asleep at the wheel. What surprised me most wasn't how aggressive some people could be. It was how predictable they were. Control, money, narrative. Those were the pillars. Everything Laura and her family were doing fit neatly into that framework. They wanted financial dominance, social validation, and moral high ground. They wanted to look reasonable while forcing me into a corner. Once I understood that, I stopped reacting to individual incidents. I started thinking about the endgame. At home, I stayed cooperative. Agreeable, even. I let Laura believe her dismissiveness was working. I nodded when her mother suggested things that chipped away at my role. I played into the version of me they expected to see. Tired, compliant, slightly confused. It wasn't easy. There were moments it felt humiliating. But every time I wanted to push back, I reminded myself that clarity was my advantage now, not confrontation. Behind the scenes, I tightened everything that mattered. I separated my finances completely, but subtly. No dramatic moves. No sudden withdrawals. Just a slow redirection of income, bonuses, reimbursements. I made sure nothing looked suspicious on the surface. I documented everything Laura did with money. Every explanation she gave, every inconsistency. I stopped relying on memory and started relying on records. I also paid close attention to how they treated my son. This was the hardest part, because it was where their masks slipped the least. They were careful around him. But there were moments, small, telling moments, that showed how they were already framing me in their minds. Comments about how mommy handles things better, or how daddy is very busy and stressed. Suggestions that maybe he should spend more nights at their house, to give everyone space. I never argued in front of him. I never contradicted them outright. I just made sure I was present. Consistent. Calm. I became the stable reference point. And I made notes. Dates. Phrases. Context. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was preserving truth. The next phase of the setup involved people. I reached out to my parents and told them a version of the truth. Not everything. Just enough to explain why I might need support soon. They were shocked, angry on my behalf, but they listened when I asked them to stay calm and quiet. That restraint mattered more than outrage. I reconnected with friends I drifted away from during my marriage. Not to vent, just to rebuild a network that existed outside Laura's family. People who knew me before all of this. People who could vouch for my character without being prompted. At work, I continued leaning into responsibility. I accepted a role that came with more visibility and more autonomy. It wasn't about money, although that helped. It was about stability. About making sure that no one could later paint me as unreliable or disengaged. Laura noticed. Again, "You're really busy lately," she said one night, watching me pack my bag for an early meeting. "Good busy," I replied. She studied me for a moment, like she was trying to reconcile the version of me she expected with the one standing in front of her. Then she smiled and said nothing. Her mother, on the other hand, became more overt. She started dropping comments about separation as if it were already inevitable, framing it as concern, as foresight. She suggested mediation before things got ugly. She asked hypothetical questions about custody schedules, always in a tone that implied I'd be lucky to get what I got. I listened. I asked questions of my own, careful ones. I let her talk. People like her reveal more than they realize when they think they're educating you. One afternoon, she slipped and mentioned something she shouldn't have known yet. A detail about my work schedule that I hadn't shared. It confirmed something I'd suspected for a while. Laura was feeding her information constantly. Real-time updates. Emotional cues. Financial details. They weren't just planning around me. They were monitoring me. So I gave them something to monitor. I intentionally appeared more worn down. I mentioned being overwhelmed. I let Laura think she was gaining ground emotionally. I agreed to let her handle a few more logistics. I watched as her confidence grew, as her mother became bolder, as the conversations shifted from contingency planning to assumption. They began talking as if the outcome was already decided. That's when I knew the timing was approaching. The final part of the setup was the hardest to accept, even knowing it was necessary. I prepared myself to let them make the first obvious move. Everything I'd learned told me that people who believe they have control eventually overreach. They push too far. They make a move that can't be explained away. And when they do, it creates a moment. A clean line between before and after. I didn't know exactly what that move would be yet, but I knew it was coming. The signs were there. Laura became more distant, more formal. Her mother started acting like a mediator instead of a relative. There were sudden conversations about legal fairness, about protecting everyone involved, about what was best for the child. They thought they were softening me up. What they didn't see was that every step they took forward tightened the frame around them. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't scrambling to save a version of my life that no longer existed. I was waiting. And the waiting wasn't passive. It was deliberate, controlled, anchored in the certainty that when the moment came, I would be ready to act, not emotionally, not impulsively, but decisively. The night before everything shifted, Laura sat across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, her expression unreadable. She said, casually, "We need to talk tomorrow. About us. About next steps." I nodded, calm on the surface, steady inside. Because I already knew. And this time, I wouldn't be caught standing in the hallway, listening in silence. The conversation Laura wanted never happened the way she expected it to. The next morning, before she could bring it up again, I told her I needed to leave early for work. I kissed our son goodbye, smiled at her like everything was normal, and walked out the door with a calm I didn't feel. But I didn't go to the office. I went somewhere far more important. By noon, the last pieces were in place. When I came home that evening, Laura was already waiting at the kitchen table. Her phone was face down. Her posture was rigid in that way people get when they've rehearsed a speech too many times. Her mother wasn't there, but I could feel her presence anyway, like she was listening through the walls. Laura didn't waste time. I think we both know things haven't been working, she said carefully. And I don't want this to turn into something ugly. I nodded. Neither do I. That surprised her. I saw it in the way her eyebrows lifted just slightly. She continued, laying out the version of reality they'd been building for months. How she'd been carrying the emotional load. How I'd become distant. How separation might be healthiest, especially for our son. She talked about fairness. About cooperation. About doing this the right way. When she finally paused, waiting for me to respond, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't plead. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table between us. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me. What's that? Everything, I said. She laughed softly. Scott, you don't need to. I've already filed. I continued, my voice even. For divorce. And for temporary full custody. The room went silent. Her face drained of color. What? I also locked down my income, froze all joint credit access, and documented every unauthorized transfer from our accounts over the last year. I slid a few pages out of the folder. Dates, amounts, explanations you gave me, including the ones that didn't match. She stared at the papers like they were written in another language. I didn't confront you, I said, not unkindly. I didn't interrupt your plans. I didn't even argue when you started limiting my access to my own money. I just paid attention. Her mouth opened, then closed again. You can't do this without talking to me first. I did talk to you, I replied. You told me I was overthinking. You told me I was the problem. Her phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it. I also submitted transcripts of conversations you and your mother had in shared spaces, I added, including discussions about draining accounts and coordinating custody outcomes. Apparently, people forget how thin walls are when they think they're already winning. Her hand shook as she picked up the folder. You recorded us? I documented what I heard, I said. There's a difference. She stood abruptly. My mother will destroy you over this. I met her eyes. She already tried. That's when her phone rang again. She answered this time, pacing as she spoke in urgent whispers. I didn't need to hear the words to know what was happening. The plan was unraveling faster than they could adjust. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Within 48 hours, Laura's mother went from confident strategist to frantic damage controller. The lawyer she'd recommended to Laura declined representation once he reviewed the documentation. Mutual friends began asking questions when inconsistencies in Laura's story surfaced. The narrative they'd been crafting quietly collapsed under the weight of facts. The custody hearing was brief. I didn't grandstand. I didn't accuse. I presented records, timelines, and testimony that spoke for itself. The judge didn't need drama to see what had happened. Temporary full custody was granted pending further evaluation, with supervised visitation recommended until financial matters were resolved. Laura cried in the hallway afterward. Her mother argued loudly with anyone who would listen. Her brother avoided eye contact. I felt nothing but relief. Over the next few months, the truth spread the way it always does when no one is actively trying to control it. Laura's mother lost credibility within her own extended family. People who'd quietly gone along with her dominance suddenly remembered their own grievances. The financial expertise she prided herself on was scrutinized and found lacking. Doors closed. Laura tried to negotiate once she realized there was no leverage left. Apologies came late and sounded hollow. Promises were made that would have mattered a year earlier. By then, I was already gone. I moved into a smaller place closer to work and my son's school. I built a routine that was quiet and solid. Morning breakfasts, evening walks, weekend projects that reminded me how capable I was without anyone managing me. The divorce finalized cleanly, fairly, without the windfall they'd expected. Laura moved back in with her parents for a while. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I don't hate her. I don't hate her family either. Hate takes energy I'd rather spend on the life I rebuilt. What I do have now is clarity. I learned that trust without awareness is not loyalty. That silence can be mistaken for weakness by people who only understand force. And that the most effective response to manipulation isn't anger or revenge in the traditional sense. It's preparation. They thought I would break the moment they turned on me. Instead, I listened. I waited. And when I finally acted, I didn't need to raise my voice. I just walked away with my dignity, my child, and my future intact, and they were left standing in the kitchen, wondering when control slipped out of their hands.